On November 20th, 1969 to June 11th, 1971, the Native Americans took over Alcatraz Island as an Indian land. The occupation of Alcatraz Island was led by the Native American group. Indians of all tribes draw on a powerful historic point of Native people taking a stand for the return of illegally taken land. A small group of Sioux demonstrated by occupying the island for 4 hours. The Sioux activists were led by Richard Mackenzie, Mark Martinez, Garfield Spotted Elk, and Alan Coiter. Coiter acted as a spokesman for the demonstration, stating that it was peaceful and in accordance with Sioux treaty rights. The United Council of the Bay Area Indian Community initially considered writing a proposal and filming an application for the use of Alcatraz by Sioux people under the conditions of their treaty. The protest group chose the name Indians of All Tribes Reservation in Minnesota, who owned. Adam Nordwall was a middle-aged businessman from the Red Lake Reservation in Minnesota who owned a pest control company, and Richard Oakes, a young a young iron worker who led the East Coast and traveled to San Francisco. He stated, "We will purchase," said Alcatraz Island for the $24 in glass beads and red cloth. Read a proclamation by the group. As set by the white man's purchase of similar island about 300 years ago, we know that $24 in trade goods for these 16 acres is more than we paid when Manhattan Island was sold, but we know that the land values have risen over the years. The American Indian movement was to help Indians in urban ghettos who had been displaced by government programs that had the effect of forcing them from the reservations. The Indians demanded economic independence of traditional culture, protection of legal rights, and most especially to get back the tribal areas they had before and to restore those lands they believed had been illegally seized. On November 20th, 1969, 70 Native Americans gathered on a dock in San Francisco Bay and boarded 3 boats that sailed from the harbor to Alcatraz Island. The previous attempts to occupy the island has been made by Native American activists who cited provisions in the Fort Lamari Treaty of 1868. The treaty left the land unused federal lands that could be open to claims by certain Native Americans. Alcatraz was categorized as surplus land by the United States government, where it was sitting unused since the prison last closed in 1963. After the San Francisco American Indian Center burned down, the community needed a new place to gather. These Indian activists were mostly California college students that boated to the largely abandoned island in San Francisco Bay, starting an unalarmed occupation that lasted nearly 19 months and captured the attention of media around the world. The Indian activists got to the island by asking 14 fishermen to give them all a ride to the island. Some Indians even swam over to hunker down. The protesting and activists were noticed by Native Americans across the country who were suffering under federal policies of relocation and termination, by which the government was encouraging Native Americans to leave reservations for cities and seeking to end federal The occupation was widely and excitedly covered by the media and generated a broad popular interest in the occupiers' work, expressing broken treaties, broken promises of their culture. In secret negotiations, the occupiers refused to leave, and the government decided to apply more pressure. Electricity and telephone services were cut off, followed by water. On the night of June 1st, 1971, a fire broke out which destroyed several buildings. The government blamed the occupiers, who blamed government infiltrators. The number of occupiers went down. A few days later, with the president's approval, the feds made their move. On July 11, 1971, nearly 18 months after the start of the occupation, federal marshals came ashore and evicted the last 15 occupiers. As a direct result of the occupation, federal policies of relocation and termination were abandoned and numerous laws were passed to support Native American self-determination, health, and education. Tribal lands across the country were returned from Mount Adams in Washington to 48,000 acres around Blue Lake in New Mexico. Today, the island is part of the National Park Service, hosting hundreds of thousands of people for tours each year. Eagle, who now lives on reservation in Federal officials also started listening to calls for Indian self-determination, even as the Alcatraz protest was still underway in July 1970. President Richard had given a speech saying, "The time has come for a new era in which the Indian future is determined by Indian acts and Indian decisions." The U.S. government later returned millions of acres of Indian land and passed more than 50 legislative proposals supporting tribal self-rule.